The little girl lived in a quiet neighborhood where houses stood close to each other and children often played in the streets. She was just 8 years old, small in size but big at heart. Her family did not have much money, but she never let that stop her from smiling. She was always the kind of child who would share even the smallest thing she had, because to her, happiness was only real when shared. That afternoon, the sky was filled with gray clouds, and a light chill moved through the air. Most children had already gone home, but the little girl enjoyed walking in the park after school. She liked the sound of leaves under her shoes and the way birds fluttered around the trees. In her small school bag, she carried one cookie that her mother had packed for her. It wasn't much, just a simple homemade cookie wrapped in paper, but it was special to her. She had saved it for later, maybe to enjoy while sitting on her favorite bench near the fountain. As she walked further, she noticed something unusual. On one of the benches near the path, a man was sitting alone. He looked different from the people she usually saw there. His shoulders were slightly bent, his face was tired, and his eyes seemed to be staring at the ground without really seeing anything. He wore a nice suit, but it looked wrinkled, like he had been sitting there for hours without caring about how he looked. The little girl slowed her steps, curious about him. She didn't know who he was, but something in his expression made her pause. Children are quick to notice feelings. Though she did not fully understand what sadness in an adult meant, she could feel that he was not happy. He looked like someone who had lost something important, like someone who needed a reason to smile again. She stood for a moment, her cookie still in her hand. She thought about how she was hungry and had waited to eat it later. But then she looked at the man again. His eyes looked lonely. Without thinking too much, she walked closer. The man did not notice her at first. He was lost in his own thoughts, thinking about all the pressures in his life. His company was facing problems, and though he was a successful CEO, he felt empty inside. He had money, cars, and a big house, but none of it gave him peace anymore. He had been sitting there to escape the noise of his world, but instead he had only found silence that made his loneliness heavier. Suddenly, a small voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me," the girl said softly. The man looked up, surprised. He saw the little girl standing there, holding something in her hand. Her face was bright, with the kind of innocent smile that only children have. "This is for you," she said simply, stretching her small hand toward him. In her palm was the cookie she had saved for herself. For a moment, the man just stared at it. He was shocked. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had offered him something without expecting anything in return. His business meetings were always full of deals, numbers, and conditions. Even when people smiled at him, he often wondered what they wanted. But here was a child, offering him the only snack she had, with no reason except kindness. "Why?" he asked, his voice low and almost breaking. "Because you look sad," she answered. She didn't explain more. To her, the reason was simple and clear. If someone looked sad, you gave them what you had to make them feel better. That was all she knew. The man felt something inside him shift. It was a small gesture, but it touched a place in his heart that had been quiet for too long. He slowly reached out and took the cookie from her hand, his eyes never leaving her small, sincere face. "Thank you," he whispered. The girl nodded, happy that he accepted it. She didn't wait for him to say more. For her, kindness was like giving a flower to a stranger, something done quickly, without thinking about rewards. She smiled one last time and skipped away toward the fountain, leaving him sitting there with the cookie in his hand. The man sat still, holding the cookie carefully as if it were more precious than gold. It wasn't the cookie itself that mattered. It was what it meant. In that single act, the little girl reminded him of something he had forgotten, the power of simple kindness. For so long, his life had been about deadlines, profit, and competition. He had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for in such a pure way. He looked around the park, watching the children play and the parents talking with each other. Life was happening all around him, yet he had been blind to it because of his worries. Now, because of one small girl and her cookie, he felt a warmth he had not felt in years. As he finally took a bite of the cookie, he smiled to himself. It wasn't the taste that mattered, though it was sweet. It was the feeling of being noticed, of being given something from the heart. He leaned back on the bench and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memory of the little girl's smile sink into his mind. He didn't even know her name, but he knew he would never forget her. That evening, when the little girl reached home, she didn't tell her mother what she had done. To her, it was not a big story. She simply washed her hands, sat at the table, and ate dinner with her family. She felt light inside, like she had done something good. She never guessed that her small action had touched a man so deeply that it would stay with him for the rest of his life. The man, meanwhile, went home carrying more than just the taste of a cookie. He carried a seed of change planted by a child who had nothing but chose to give everything she had in that moment. The man sat on the bench long after the little girl had left, still holding the cookie she had given him. It was such a small thing, yet he could not stop thinking about it. He kept asking himself why a child who did not even know him would care enough to share her only snack. It had been years since he had felt that kind of pure kindness. In his world, people usually came to him with papers to sign, deals to discuss, or problems to solve. They rarely came with a simple smile or a gift without expecting anything in return. That man was Daniel. Most people who knew him in the city called him Mr. Gray, the CEO of a large company that owned several offices across the country. He had started from nothing in his younger years, working hard day and night to build his business. Now he had wealth, cars, and a luxurious house. He had everything that many people only dreamed about. But what he didn't have was peace. For a long time, he had been carrying a heavy feeling inside him. Daniel had lost touch with people in a real way. His employees respected him, but they also feared him because he was strict and serious. His friends from earlier days no longer called him often, because they felt he was too busy for them. Even his family lived far away and rarely saw him. He spent most of his days in meetings, and when he went home, he would sit in silence, tired but not truly resting. He had money in his account, but no joy in his heart. On that day, he had come to the park because he was feeling more broken than usual. His company was facing a crisis. A few projects had failed, and his investors were pressuring him. He had been working endlessly, trying to fix everything, but nothing seemed enough. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. That was why he had come to the park, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind. But instead of peace, he had found himself sinking deeper into sadness. Until, of course, the little girl appeared. Her cookie was more than just a snack. It was a reminder that life was not only about numbers, profits, or titles. Life was about people, about small moments, and about kindness. Daniel held the cookie like it was a message, a silent letter from the universe telling him not to give up and not to forget what really mattered. He finally stood up and slowly began walking out of the park. His steps were slower than usual, and his mind was filled with thoughts. He wondered who the girl was. She looked so simple, her clothes were neat but not fancy, and she had spoken in such a natural way. Did she live nearby? Did she often come to the park? He wanted to ask her name, but she had left so quickly. All he had was her smile in his memory. That night, when Daniel reached home, he sat in his living room quietly. The large house was silent. Expensive paintings hung on the walls, soft lights glowed in every corner, but the place felt empty. Normally, he would turn on his laptop and continue working late into the night. But that evening, he couldn't. Instead, He placed the small piece of cookie he hadn't eaten yet on a napkin and stared at it as if it were something rare. He thought about the girl again and again. He whispered to himself, "A cookie changed my day." Then he smiled, though only slightly. It was the first true smile he had allowed himself in weeks. As he leaned back in his chair, memories of his childhood returned to him. He remembered being a boy running through the streets, laughing with friends, sharing simple food, and dreaming about the future. Back then, he didn't have much money, but he had love and warmth around him. Over the years, as he built his empire, he had forgotten those little joys. He had thought success meant bigger offices, more profits, and endless growth. But now he realized he had built walls around himself. He had been living in those walls, away from the simple kindness that once made him happy. The next morning, Daniel went to work, but something inside him had changed. His employees noticed that his expression was softer. He greeted the receptionist with a smile, something he rarely did. In his meeting, instead of speaking only about numbers and deadlines, he asked his managers how they were doing. At first, they were surprised, almost confused. But he knew this was the start of something new. All through the day, he carried the memory of the girl. He thought of her words, "Because you look sad." It was so simple, but it had touched him more than the longest speeches ever could. He realized he had been walking through life with sadness hidden behind his expensive suit, and no one had cared enough to notice. But a child did. A child who didn't know his name, his position, or his power. She had seen only a sad man and decided to give him something. That evening, Daniel found himself returning to the same park. He sat on the same bench, hoping that maybe he would see the little girl again. He looked around at the families walking, children playing with balls, and couples strolling hand in hand. But she wasn't there. He waited for a long time, watching the sun go down, but she never came. Still, he didn't feel disappointed. Even though he didn't see her, the memory was alive inside him. He realized it wasn't about finding her again. It was about carrying forward what she had given him, a reminder of kindness and humanity. Over the next few days, Daniel started noticing things he had ignored before. When he walked into his office building, he noticed the janitor sweeping the floor and nodded at him with respect. When he visited a restaurant, he looked at the waiter and thanked him sincerely instead of just signing the bill. These were small actions, but to him, they felt new. It was as if he was learning how to connect again. One night, as he lay in bed, he thought deeply. He asked himself, what am I really living for? Is it just to grow my company bigger? Or is it to leave something meaningful behind? The answer came to him slowly. He wanted to be remembered not only as a successful businessman but also as a good human being. And all of this had started because of one little girl with one cookie. Daniel smiled softly as he drifted to sleep. He didn't know where she was or who she truly was, but he knew that their brief meeting was not an accident. It was a turning point. He didn't need her name to keep her in his heart. She had already given him more than she could imagine, a new way of seeing life. Daniel woke up the next morning with a lighter feeling in his heart. It was unusual for him because most mornings he used to wake up with a heavy head, already worried about the long list of tasks waiting for him. But this time, something was different. He could still picture the small hand of the little girl, offering him the cookie. He could still hear her innocent words. And he could still see the honest smile on her face. At breakfast, instead of rushing through his meal while checking his phone, he sat quietly with a cup of tea and thought about his life. His house was quiet, filled with expensive furniture, paintings, and fine decorations. Yet, none of those things gave him warmth. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he had been chasing the wrong kind of happiness for years. He thought money would bring peace, but it hadn't. What brought him peace was something simple: a child's kindness. When he reached his office that day, People noticed the difference in him again. His assistant entered his cabin with a worried look, holding a pile of files. Normally, Daniel would barely look up and quickly tell her to leave the documents on the table. But this time, he asked her how she was doing. She was so surprised that she stopped speaking for a moment before replying. He even listened carefully when she explained her family was going through a small difficulty. He nodded and told her to take the time she needed. The assistant left his office with wide eyes, almost in disbelief. Daniel leaned back in his chair after she left. He realized that for years, he had seen his employees only as people who worked for him. He had not cared about their feelings, their struggles, or their dreams. But wasn't it true that they were humans first before being workers? He had forgotten that simple truth. The girl had reminded him that small gestures mattered. Later that afternoon, he had an important meeting with his managers. Usually, such meetings were tense, with Daniel speaking sharply and the managers nervously trying not to make mistakes. But this time, he spoke with calmness. He still talked about the challenges the company was facing, but his words carried encouragement instead of fear. He asked his managers what ideas they had and listened patiently instead of cutting them off. For the first time in years, his team felt heard. They left the meeting room feeling inspired instead of pressured. When Daniel returned home that night, he didn't switch on his laptop right away. Instead, he sat near the window and looked out at the city lights. His mind returned again and again to the park and to the girl. He wished he had asked her name, but maybe it was better this way. She was like a messenger who had come into his life for just a moment, left behind a gift, and then disappeared. That mystery made her kindness even more powerful. He took out a notebook from his desk drawer. It had been years since he had written anything personal, but he felt like writing down his thoughts. He wrote about the girl, the cookie, and the way it made him feel. Then he wrote something that surprised even himself: "I don't want to live only for profit anymore. I want to live for people." When he read those words again, he felt a strange sense of relief. It was as if he had finally admitted what his heart wanted. The following days, Daniel began changing small things about his routine. Instead of spending all his weekends in the office, he started taking walks in the park again. Sometimes he would sit on the same bench where he had met the girl, quietly observing families and children. He didn't see her again, but he didn't lose hope. Even without her, the memory was enough to keep him moving forward. One evening, he noticed a homeless man sitting near the gate of the park. The man's clothes were old and torn, and he looked hungry. People walked past him, some even turning their faces away. Daniel felt something stir inside him. He remembered how the little girl had noticed his sadness when no one else did. He thought, if a child can notice me, why can't I notice him? Without hesitation, Daniel went to a nearby shop, bought some food, and gave it to the homeless man. The man's tired face lit up with gratitude. Daniel felt a warmth in his chest, the same warmth he had felt when he received the cookie. From that moment on, he started helping people quietly. It was not about showing off. It was about doing what felt right. He paid for a struggling mother's groceries in the supermarket without telling her his name. He arranged for one of his junior employees, who had financial trouble, to receive extra support. He even began greeting the security guard at his office every morning with a genuine smile. These were small actions, but to Daniel, they were powerful. Each act reminded him of the girl and the lesson she had unknowingly given him. But even as he did all this, Daniel's mind often returned to one question: why had the girl given him the cookie so naturally? She hadn't thought twice. She didn't know he was rich or important. To her, he was simply a sad person. That simplicity touched him deeply. It made him realize that kindness didn't need planning or wealth. It needed only a willing heart. One night, Daniel sat with his notebook again. He wrote, "Kindness is not about how much you give, but how much love you put into it." He underlined the sentence and read it several times. It became a truth he wanted to live by. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Daniel's life began to feel different. His company was still facing challenges, but instead of being crushed by stress, he felt calmer. His managers worked harder now because they respected him, not just feared him. His employees smiled more when they saw him. And Daniel himself found that he slept better at night. He didn't realize it yet, but he was changing in a way that would soon affect many lives. A cookie given by a child was slowly becoming the seed of a much bigger transformation. He had been walking alone in darkness for a long time, but now he felt as if he had found a small light. He didn't know where it would lead him, but he was ready to follow it. And somewhere in the same city, the little girl was living her simple life, unaware that her small act of sharing had touched a man so deeply. She had no idea that her cookie was not just a sweet snack, but the beginning of a new story, his story of rediscovering kindness and humanity. Daniel's life was slowly taking a new shape. Each day felt different now. He was no longer rushing from meeting to meeting with a tired heart. Instead, he carried with him a quiet joy, a soft reminder that life was not only about success but also about connection. The little girl's smile stayed in his memory like sunlight that never faded. Still, there was a part of him that wanted to see her again. He wanted to thank her properly, maybe even tell her how much her single cookie had changed his way of thinking. So, on many evenings after work, he found himself returning to the park. He would sit on the same bench where he first saw her, his eyes moving toward the fountain and the pathways, hoping to catch a glimpse of her small figure skipping happily. But the days passed, and she did not appear. At first, this made him a little sad, but then he realized something. The girl's purpose in his life was not about being found again. She had already given him the gift he needed. It was not her presence that mattered anymore, but her lesson. And so, while he still wished to see her, he stopped waiting with disappointment. Instead, he carried her kindness inside him, letting it guide his own actions. One evening, as Daniel sat in the park, he noticed a young boy struggling to carry a bag of books. The boy dropped them and looked around helplessly as the pages scattered. Without thinking twice, Daniel stood up and walked over to help him pick them up. The boy smiled shyly, thanking him. Daniel patted his shoulder and told him he had done well to carry so much on his own. The boy's face brightened, and he ran off happily. Daniel returned to his bench, feeling the same warmth he had felt when the girl had given him the cookie. From that day forward, Daniel started looking for small ways to help people. He realized that opportunities for kindness were everywhere if only one paid attention. At his office, he noticed an employee who always stayed late, working quietly in the corner. Daniel approached him one evening and asked why he worked so late. The young man hesitated at first but then explained that he had a sick mother at home, and he was trying to earn extra to pay for her medicines. Daniel listened carefully and then arranged support for him through the company. The young man's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. Another time, Daniel saw a delivery man waiting outside his building, shivering in the cold as he held a food package. Daniel invited him inside to warm up for a few minutes before handing over the delivery. The man left with a grateful smile. For Daniel, these small acts became like treasures. Each one reminded him of the cookie, and each one added meaning to his days. Even though his company was still facing challenges, Daniel felt calmer. His managers worked harder now, inspired by his new attitude. They noticed that he was listening more, supporting their ideas, and caring about their well-being. For the first time, the workplace felt less like a battlefield and more like a team moving together. Slowly, the problems began to look smaller, not because they disappeared, but because everyone felt stronger facing them together. At night, Daniel often opened his notebook and wrote about his day. He wrote about the little acts of kindness he had done or received. Sometimes he wrote about the girl, imagining what her life might be like. He wondered if she went to school nearby, if she had friends to play with, if she carried cookies often in her little bag. He smiled whenever he thought of her, grateful that their paths had crossed, even for a short time. One Saturday, Daniel decided to do something different. He drove to a shelter home for children that his company had once donated money to but had not visited in years. When he entered, the children ran around with bright eyes, some playing games, others drawing pictures. Daniel walked through the rooms, speaking kindly to them, asking about their dreams. Many of them wanted to be teachers, doctors, or artists. Their innocent voices touched him deeply. He realized that real wealth was not in his bank accounts but in moments like these, seeing hope in the eyes of children. After leaving the shelter, Daniel sat in his car quietly. He remembered again the girl's words, "Because you look sad." That simple sentence had carried so much power. It had been a mirror, showing him his own emptiness, and at the same time, offering him a way out of it. He whispered softly to himself, "I will not waste this gift." From then on, Daniel began creating small programs in his company to support people. He arranged scholarships for employees' children, set up a fund to help workers during emergencies, and encouraged his managers to spend time listening to their teams instead of only chasing results. Slowly, a culture of kindness began to grow inside the company. Employees felt proud to work there, not just for the salary but because they felt valued as humans. Yet, in his heart, Daniel never forgot the source of this change: the little girl in the park. Every time he made a decision to help someone, he felt as though he was continuing what she had started. He imagined her smiling if she could see how far her cookie had gone. She would never know, but her small act had created a ripple that touched many lives. One evening, after a long but satisfying day, Daniel returned to the park again. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Children were still playing, their laughter filling the air. He sat on his usual bench, breathing deeply, letting the peace of the park settle inside him. He thought about the journey he had taken in the past few weeks. From a man drowning in loneliness to someone rediscovering joy through kindness, it felt almost like a miracle. As he sat there, a mother walked past with her daughter. The little girl was not the one he was searching for, but she reminded him of her. She held her mother's hand, skipping along, her small bag bouncing against her side. Daniel smiled gently as he watched them. He realized then that he didn't need to meet the same girl again. What mattered was carrying her lesson and sharing it with the world. He leaned back on the bench, his eyes lifting to the sky. The air felt cooler now, the evening calm wrapping around him like a soft blanket. In that moment, he whispered quietly to himself, "Thank you, little one. You gave me back my heart." Weeks turned into months, and Daniel's life was no longer the same as before. The man who once walked with a heavy heart, drowning in deadlines and loneliness, now lived with a sense of meaning he had never known. The little girl had given him nothing more than a cookie, yet it had changed the direction of his life. Every time he remembered that moment, he felt like life had pressed a reset button for him. His company began to reflect his new way of living. The programs he started, scholarships, support funds, and open-door talks with employees had slowly created a different atmosphere in the workplace. People who once feared him now respected him from the heart. They saw that he cared not only about the business but about their lives too. When employees walked past him in the hallway, they smiled openly instead of looking away nervously. The office felt lighter, filled with cooperation instead of silent tension. But the biggest change was inside Daniel himself. He no longer saw life only as a race for profit. He saw it as a chance to touch lives, even in small ways. He began spending his weekends not at his desk but out in the community. Sometimes he visited schools to speak to children about dreams and hard work. Other times he went to shelters or hospitals, offering support quietly. He never announced these things to the world, because he didn't want attention. He wanted to give with the same innocence that the little girl had given him her cookie with no expectation of return. One day, Daniel sat in his office, looking at the city through the tall glass window. He thought about how far he had come since that moment in the park. He realized he wanted to do something bigger, something that would last even after he was gone. He picked up his notebook and wrote a single sentence: "Kindness must continue." That idea grew in his mind until it became a plan. He decided to create a foundation in his company's name, a foundation that would focus on helping children, families in need, and communities struggling to survive. The next month, the foundation was launched. At the opening event, people clapped and praised Daniel for his generosity. But as he stood at the podium, giving his speech, his thoughts drifted to the little girl. He wished she could see this moment. He wished she could know that her simple act had grown into something so big. He imagined her sitting somewhere, eating another cookie happily, unaware that she had been the spark for a fire of kindness. In his speech, Daniel said something that surprised many people in the audience. He said, "This foundation was inspired by a small child whose name I do not know. One day, when I was at my lowest point, she gave me her only cookie, simply because I looked sad. That moment reminded me what life is truly about: kindness. Today, everything you see here is because of her." The audience grew quiet, moved by the story. Some wiped away tears. They realized that even the greatest changes could begin with the smallest acts. After the event, reporters wanted to know more about the mysterious girl, but Daniel could only shake his head. He had no answers, only memories. And he chose to keep it that way. She was not someone to be put in newspapers or turned into a symbol. She was simply a child who had done something natural and pure. That was the beauty of it. As the foundation began its work, more and more people were touched. Schools received new books and supplies. Families who struggled to put food on the table were given support. Children who had dreams but no means to follow them were offered scholarships. Every project carried Daniel's silent promise to the little girl: "Your kindness lives on." In his private moments, Daniel often returned to the park. He still sat on the same bench, watching the world go by. He still hoped, deep down, that one day he might see her again. But even if he didn't, he felt at peace. She had already given him everything he needed. One spring evening, as he sat there, the air filled with the sound of children laughing. Parents walked with their little ones, couples strolled hand in hand, and the fountain sparkled under the setting sun. Daniel looked around with a gentle smile. For the first time in many years, he no longer felt lonely. He realized he was connected to all these people in some invisible way through kindness. As he sat quietly, he thought about how much one small act could mean. A child giving her only cookie was such a tiny moment in the grand picture of life, yet it had changed not only his world but also the lives of countless others through him. He whispered to himself, "The ripple is still moving." He imagined the kindness spreading further and further, touching people he would never even meet. The little girl, wherever she was, had no idea what she had started. Perhaps she was still going to school, perhaps she was laughing with her friends, or perhaps she was at home helping her parents. She was living her simple life, unaware that somewhere in the city, a man's heart had been healed by her. And maybe that was how it was meant to be. True kindness did not wait for applause. It lived quietly, like a seed growing into a tree, giving shade and fruit without asking for anything back. Daniel often thought about how different his life might have been if she had not stopped that day. Maybe he would have remained in the darkness of his loneliness. Maybe he would have continued chasing numbers without ever finding peace. Maybe he would have lost himself completely. But fate had sent a little girl his way, and she had shown him the path back to his own humanity. Years later, when people spoke about Daniel Gray, they no longer spoke only about the successful CEO. They spoke about the man who cared, the man who built a foundation that helped thousands, the man who believed in kindness. And whenever Daniel heard this, he smiled quietly, because he knew the truth. It had all started with a cookie. On his desk, he kept one page from his notebook where he had written, "Kindness is not about how much you give, but how much love you put into it." That sentence became the guiding star of his life. He had lived by it every day since the little girl reminded him of what he had forgotten. And so the story closed in a circle. A lonely man found hope through a child's simple act. A child who never knew the weight of her gift. And a world that changed, quietly and beautifully, because one person dared to share what little they had with someone who needed it most.